I'm so pleased to be here with you today. Um, as I go through what the learning outcomes are intended to be for this webinar, it would be lovely. I know some of you have started to chat, but it would be lovely to just have your name and the part of BC you're in or the institution that you're affiliated with, just to chat with each other, so that there's a little bit more of an exchange. And if you like, you can use your emoji function on Zoom and just give us a picture of how you're feeling today. So the focus of our conversation today is on what people can do in all levels of an organization. So what steps both frontline staff and people leaders can take to build an inclusive environment for all the people that are in the care settings. So we'll go through what all of those different levels are and some things that we can do at each juncture that we work at individually. And I'm hoping that you'll come away from this with these 5 insights. Insights into what EDI is, sharing and learning from each other a bit, and that's why I like to use the chat as much as possible. And of course, we'll also have questions throughout and questions at the end. Discovering some simple strategies for making healthcare services more inclusive and accessible to diverse populations, understanding how social identities impact the aging process, and identify some actionable changes to create a supportive and inclusive workplace and environment. So as we move through this, I think it's helpful to just have some clear definitions. EDI just literally stands for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I know that you've had some trainings on this, and some of you may have attended those. But what's the point of those words? Really, it is about creating an environment where everyone feels like they belong, that they have equal opportunities, they're empowered to do their best work, and that everyone feels comfortable making requests and contributing ideas. So this includes staff as well as residents, because our residents need to be able to feel literally at home. So DEI, therefore, should create a true sense of belonging. And as you can see from this Venn diagram, where the circles overlap in the very middle, you have a healthy DEI functioning organization that creates belonging. And you'll see that those things outside the Venn diagram, or where the circles don't overlap, create stagnant organizations that don't benefit from their diverse staff, their diverse clients or patients, the communities they're situated within, and the leaders that might be bringing those experiences as well. So for instance, you have like in this area here, the dominant group or ideology is deferred to for all decision-making and opportunities and promotions. And things like this, saturation of similarity, homogeneous culture, and simplified points of view. So that just means basically that not everyone can bring their whole selves to work. And that's what we want to avoid. And that's what DEI helps us think about and focus on. But it goes beyond employment. So it is crucially an aspect of employment and employment obligations, but it's an all of organization thing to be thinking about. It's a system approach. And it comes under other names. You'll hear it referred to in other names. So things like justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which has the fun acronym of JEDI, which I like because it has that kind of like warrior aspect to it. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, which shortens to IDEA. Equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, which acknowledges the land that we're on, as we did today in opening this session. And another term that's used is substantive equality, and that's for the lawyers in the group. And that's my background and training. So I find that phrasing is helpful, but you don't need to worry about all the terminology, but just know that when you hear those phrases, this is what we're talking about. Such as income and social status, employment and working conditions, education and literacy, and the cumulative burden of discrimination and intergenerational trauma. So these are some of the things that you have probably spoken about in some of your other webinars. But these inequities in health also reflect differences in access to health services, and that's where we come in, including discrimination within the healthcare system. And this has been a huge problem across Canada. But this particular study that I'm referring to was from BC. So we have to think of all people and all levels of organizations, because the climate of the service and those being supported in care homes, for instance, is set by the work culture that the frontline caregivers experience. So if I'm being treated poorly, it's going to be very hard for me to find the resources to be a good resource to the person who's in need of care. So that's why caring for the caregiver means setting a standard of respect that applies to everyone. Now, when I say everyone, what do I mean? I mean who's staying with us in our care settings, that is the client, the patient, who is working here and providing care, so frontline workers, and also who are the leaders and who's leading in this sector. So we're going to look at all three of these areas as potential places to make a positive difference as we talk about DEI. So when we think about BC, apologies for the ugly graph, but it's actually excellent information. It shows us who is staying with us in long-term care homes. We know a few things about who's staying. 92.7% of British Columbians over 65 are white European descent. So what does this make you think of? What are some of the risks involved in having a large majority that's used to being part of the dominant culture? Well, are the old people of color, the old Black people, old Chinese people, old South Asians, getting lost in the dominant culture of our homes? Are our homes catering to the dominant group in terms of food, in terms of cultural events, in terms of religious events, etc.? So that's something for us to ask ourselves. Does that particular generation of white people expect that they will be dominant and don't even see when they are being racist? And often that racism, it could be directed against another resident. It could also be directed against the caregiver. Are they taking this out in subtle and not so subtle ways on other residents or staff or community or even volunteers? Does this impact workers? Do we get lazy or exhausted thinking about ways to address it? And our leaders need to help us make sure that we're addressing it. So we know a few things. Pardon me, I have a dry throat. We know a few things about residents in long-term care specifically. We know that 2/3 of residents are female. So that right there tells you some issues about gender that we need to attend to. We also know that in the general population, not specific to those in care homes, women at about a rate of about 50% will have experienced some form of violence across their lifespan. So we may be seeing older women who've experienced either domestic violence or some other form of childhood violence who are now aging. And as they age, some of the behaviors that they might exhibit might be related to these early experiences. They might be initially inexplicable to us, but they might be linked to some early trauma issues. So we know that the percentage of residents exhibiting physically abusive behavior, either easily altered or not easily altered, was 9% in the surveys that were done in 2018, 2019. So it's slightly higher in some facilities and in some health regions. But you know, the average age of residents in long-term care is 85 years old, with 60% at 85 or older. So we have a lot of old women, older women, who may have a lot of issues with both their cognition, but also early trauma. And 31% of residents are totally dependent on staff for their activities and daily living, such as bathing, getting dressed, getting out of bed. So you guys are doing some pretty hard work with a high percentage of the residents in homes. And, you know, 29% of residents in these homes also have severe cognitive impairment. So the reason I'm giving you these percentages is because you're not alone. This is a structural thing that is across the sector, and these wider studies and reports can help us kind of put into perspective the things that we're seeing in the care home that we are in. We know that 48%, that's almost half of residents, score low on the social engagement scale. So you're in a position where you're trying to help people who may not be interacting very much. So we also don't know a lot about who we are serving and who's in the province generally in terms of healthcare equity. So there are big gaps in collecting and utilizing healthcare equity data in the all across Canada, not just BC, in the long-term care sector, and it has been earmarked as an important area for improvement. The BC government has actually appointed the province's first parliamentary secretary for anti-racism initiatives. And one of their initiatives is to work on addressing discrimination in healthcare through collaborating with the Human Rights Commissioner. So keep your eye on that material, because I think that's going to be a big support to your work going forward. And so we had a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this session. How many of you have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work? Just throw it into the chat. I've heard of it. I haven't heard of it. Yeah, you know, I totally get it. And it looks like quite a few of you have heard of it. And you must know that many of the recommendations, I think 18 through 24, are all related to healthcare. So when we're thinking about whose land we're living on, and we're doing acknowledgements as we gather, which are important, I think, things for us to do, it's also critical to integrate a plan for institutional and individual truth and reconciliation. So how do our homes that we're working in integrate Indigenous teachings, for instance? The health knowledge and practices of Indigenous people that predate colonization are starting to get a lot more attention in medical research for their properties in healing across generations. How do we make our local community part of the learning journey for our home and the home we provide to seniors? Carissa, I see that folks have some raised hands. I'm wondering if there's questions that people need to address now, or if we can wait till the end.
If anyone who has their hand raised just wants to pop that in the Q&A or the chat, and then we can answer your question. Sometimes people press it by accident, so.
Okay, you keep your eye on if there's any questions, because I can't see them from my screen. And just interrupt me when you need to. So all of you are experts in this. You've watched a lot of people age. What are some of the things that matter most as you age? Well, and you can see from my gray hair, I'm starting to experience this firsthand. And all the years of my working with older adults and working particularly on elder abuse issues, it's coming home to roost for me now because I'm seeing that as I age, certain things I need more. So more than I used to. So access to things that are familiar from when I was younger, because my memory of things in the immediate past, like why did I walk through this doorway? Why am I in this room? I have to walk back out and remember why I came into the room, but I can remember things from my childhood very clearly. So access to culture is particularly important as we age. It can be very disorienting. Even if you speak English perfectly all your adult life, as you age, having access to your own language can also be extremely important because your emotions may be better expressed in your first language. Access to foods that you're familiar with. I have a friend in long-term care right now with vascular dementia, and he is almost starving himself because he can't stand the food. And it just isn't the food that he is accustomed to eating. So I'm always bringing him food. But these are the things we can address often fairly simply within our homes. Healing practices. Every culture has its own way of dealing with things like anxiety or comforting or how we heal. I have all kinds of things in my head about how my mother thought I should heal things when I was hurt. They call it old wives' tales, but often it's scientifically sound. So I want to be able to use Epsom salt when I have a sore and things like that. So sometimes these comforting things are things we can easily find out from the adults that we're working with. The health knowledge that gets passed down culturally, but also within families. So we know that those who are working and providing support and care in the front line are often racialized workers. And they're overrepresented in frontline care work. And are in the studies that I've been reading on this, they were not represented at the same rate in managerial roles. And why is this important? Because sometimes we can be oblivious to the things that we don't know. And so making sure that we take in the knowledge of all of those on the front lines who understand different cultural backgrounds and bring their own knowledge and backgrounds, that's going to be an important thing for leaders to take account of. But it's also important to understand that long-term care work has significant income disparities between workers and between workers and doctors in particular. Long-term care work has a racialized occupational segregation. And what that means is that it's often the lower paid jobs that racialized workers have and new immigrants have. And Canadian long-term care work has significant sex discrimination. We know that women dominate in these roles. And women face multiple other pressures in their lives. They're often caring for families back home. They often have children that they've been separated from who they're trying to support financially. They're often the anchor for an entire family somewhere who's counting on their salary. So these are all pressures we need to understand in the context of a predominantly older white population that may have a lot of racist ideas, and the workers are found in the studies to be putting up with a fair bit of racism in their day-to-day interactions. So what about our leaders? Who is leading in our care centers, and what can they do to help support some shifts in some of these dynamics, or to be watchful of these dynamics to make sure that they're not harmful? So leaders need to find their North Star and decide whether or not racialized, Indigenous, and LGBTQI people have a place in the future that you want to build. If the answer is yes, articulate it. Make sure it's explicit so people feel that you've got their back. And I think, when we were talking just a moment ago about the aging process, a lot of LGBTQI older adults are closeted in our homes, and they don't know that it's safe to come out. They may have had a whole life where their friends were gay and lesbian. They felt comfortable. They may have had, spaces where they were, welcomed and recognized. And they go into a long-term care home. There's no rainbow anywhere. There's no indication anywhere that there is a safe space here for them to be out and to be who they are. And they may have experienced significant discrimination throughout their lives from communities outside their core, kind of the family that their chosen family. And so these are, just examples of ways in which our homes need to adjust to make sure that people feel that they are welcome in their whole person. As a leader, making the purpose case for inclusion, it means framing inclusion as part and parcel of who you are as an organization, as an institution, as a home, and that your purpose for existing is linked to that. The values are very closely aligned: caring, compassion, human rights, access to healthcare, equal access to healthcare, which means for some people you need to go a little step further because we didn't start out equal. And being unafraid to say so publicly. Taking action to improve outcomes for your racialized and LGBTQI staff and residents. And the communities both inside and outside your organization that you might be connecting with to make sure that you are actually a known entity in the communities that are often left out of our homes. So there's this wonderful DEI practitioner called Lily Zing, and they have a couple of books that I would highly recommend to leaders. And they're in my resources at the end, so you can look them up. They say that this notion of activities as being your way of fulfilling your DEI values is a thing of the past. And instead, it's a DEI intervention that's needed. Now, what's the difference? An activity is something you do for the sake of doing it. It may be a good thing to do. It may be fun. It may be an excellent activity within your home. So it might be like an employee resource group meeting or a cultural heritage celebration, or even a training like this. It's not good or bad. It simply is. It starts, it finishes, and people move on. An intervention is something you do to achieve an outcome. Just like we had outcomes at the beginning of this webinar, we would want our DEI activities inside our institutions to have outcomes. So you would meet with your executive team to help build understanding during a major benefits policy overhaul, for instance, and look at it with a DEI perspective. A heritage celebration to on-ramp allies in the community, for instance, to bring inclusive practices into their future day-to-day team experiences on the floor. A training to build skill and familiarity with bystander intervention when witnessing acts of exclusion. An offsite to strengthen team connection and collaboration for a team that often feels distant, for instance. So we talked about how some groups of people may age in a way that they sort of recede into the woodwork of our institutions. I gave the example of LGBTQI, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and other identities that are similarly aligned. They may, experience the world that we're in now, which is there is a real backlash happening where we have provinces and school boards and presidents of countries to the south of us and premiers in some provinces trying to claw back some of the rights that have been won. And as old people, we get anxious. Some of the things that we're suffering from cognitively make us anxious to start with. And then you have this kind of fear mongering. And a lot of old people wind up sitting and watching a lot of news, and that news can also fuel their sense of isolation, particularly when we're hearing these negative things about our own communities. There's also similarly an anti-immigrant backlash that we're hearing a lot about, and this can really impact those who are working in our centers, but also those who are of a minority and living in our centers. And I think we have to be aware that no amount of being happy in front of people will take away that kind of anxiety. And it's a good idea to have plans for how to work with how that rising anxiety is, and to be clear in your policies, procedures, and in the visible surroundings of the home that you support people in these groups that are under attack currently. So when you're doing these things, whatever things you decide to do, understand the purpose of your intervention. So we were talking about interventions as distinct from just activities. So understand the purpose of your intervention. Empty words and, kind of nice fairy tale ideas about what you believe in won't cut it. How are you planning to drive behavior change? That's really what you need to be looking at. If so, what behavior, in whom, why? Why are you doing the thing? Are you trying to prime an audience, influence a decision, instill a particular feeling? In whom and why? So these are things that we think about for leaders and for teams to ask themselves. Establish metrics for your intervention. How will you know that the change has happened? How will you measure success or failure? What tools can you use to determine whether your effort was a wild success, a mixed bag, or a complete bust? So you can then modify your efforts the next time. Life is all about try again. Make a plan for deploying your intervention. How many people do you need to deploy your intervention, and track its impact rigorously? How will you analyze the data you gather? How will you prepare the audience for your intervention so that they can receive it as positively as possible? So again, when we think about some of the old people that we work with who may not have been exposed to a lot of difference or new ideas, how are we going to work with that positively and joyfully so that we're creating a culture change where them leaning over and being racist to their neighbor is not something that goes unremarked on, but is done in a way that is educative and purposeful and makes everybody feel like they're still part of the home. So then you need to communicate your impact. How will you hold yourself accountable to synthesizing the data you gather into a story? How will you tell that story both to the audience you worked with? That might be the families that support people in the home. That might be your shareholders. It might be your board of directors. It might be your senior leadership team. And what are the stakeholders resourcing you to do? So that needs to be, this isn't just something you can push off the side of your desk. It needs to be a core part of our operations. And then thinking about what did you learn and what might you take into your next intervention. So going back to basic principles, I mean, these are a lot of things to think about and a lot of, you know, big words and big concepts to try and think through. So it makes a huge difference for a frontline worker, for instance, to know that your employer is stepping up during times of global backlash against rights. And that's unfortunately, the times we are in. Many parts of the world are in open conflict, suffering from climate change disasters. And a lot of the people that we are working side by side have family in those places. And when we hear the kind of myths that are being propagated about what immigrants are and what they do and why they're here, those harmful, discriminatory and racist stereotypes are very, very hurtful. And it can really help if you know that your employer has your back and that they don't subscribe to that, and that the environment you work in is supportive. One of the things that I have been told by an Indigenous elder who I worked with on diversity issues was a very wise piece of information, that some of us are warriors and some of us are healers. Some of us have a bit of both. Most of us who work in healthcare are on the healer side, and we're not, we don't love conflict. You know, we're trained to create harmony. But we need those who are in leadership roles to have a bit of the warrior in them so that they can protect the environments that we're working in and make them into safer spaces. No space is safe completely. I think that's a misnomer and it's a high bar to try and force yourself to achieve. But we can create safer spaces and spaces where it's safe to have conversations about difficult things. And we need to make those conversations easier and more usual. The longer I'm doing this work, the easier it is to have a very frank conversation about something that just happened, and to analyze it in a compassionate way and figure out a way to change behavior in the future. So education is a great thing, but it goes both ways. We don't have the best example on a webinar like this, except through the questions that you can send and the chat. But most educational contexts, it's an exchange. It's I learned from you, you learned from me, and together we grow. And that's the same in a workplace. And it's vital to speak up and to speak out. So that little warrior part of you, when you hear something harmful that saps your energy, that you need to have your workplace deal with, then that's something that I think we need to really pay attention to. So those are our basic principles. And I think overall, together, we create the culture that we live in, all of us. And so we all bear some responsibility for ensuring that the place that we work and the place that we care for people is a place of, as I said, safer space, a place where conversations can happen and learning can happen. And so to that end, I'm going to put my camera off just for a quick second because my battery seems to be running out, which means my plug is not working. So I'm just going to fix that. And maybe you can think about some of your questions. And, you know, some things that I thought you might be interested in hearing about are what questions do you have about anything I've said so far? What experiences do you want to share that you'd like to get some reflection on? And what kinds of things are you hoping the Caring for the Caregiver series can follow up on for you as you move forward in your learning journey? So Carissa, I'm going to hand it back to you for just a moment. I'm going to leave those questions up. I also have another slide with some of the resources I used today so that you can come back to those. And then I'm just going to quickly stop my video or so that I can turn my switch on.
So if you had any questions that you wanted answered by Amanda, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, or any experiences you wanted to share yourself.
Okay, I'm just going to check the chat. Is there anything you see right off the bat, Carissa?
There's just something about, do you have international projects to share with all other countries? And that they hope in Turkey they'll start to talk and create more about EDI.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yes, I do work internationally. And most of my work is supporting people who are doing the work on the ground. So I don't go and do the work, but I support people who are doing the work in organizations like your own, direct service organizations that are working around the globe. And we work in some very tricky contexts. One of the trainings that I did go physically to deliver was in Sudan. And it was some years ago now, and unfortunately, Sudan is now a virtually non-functioning state because it has there has been a war that's been ignited between the army and a paramilitary group. And the two have essentially destroyed the capital city. I remain a support of organizations that are working to bring people who are from many different ethnic backgrounds across the country together to fight this anti-democratic movement that they've had to endure. It is actually a full-scale war, and they have lost all the infrastructure in the capital city in Khartoum. And I do this work with some of the most extraordinary and bravest, mostly women, that I have ever met. And they continue this work, trying to bring together people of like mind, no matter what their background is, and deal with some of the extraordinary human rights violations that have happened to people because of their ethnic background. And to build literally like just immediate safety for people. And often that means helping them escape the country. The level of threat that anybody who is in any way a little bit different is really quite shocking at the moment. And people are also being pursued into the third country, the second or third country that they flee to. So all of the bordering states around Sudan, which is a country that's surrounded by 7 other countries in Africa, they're finding they're being pursued there by the Sudanese authorities as well. So yes, I am working with people who have maintained a very high level of dedication to this, and in particular to the forms of gender-based violence that happen when there's conflict, because women are often the most frequent victims of lawlessness. And sexual violence is a very high threat during times of conflict. So I'm working with people in Cairo, in Nairobi, people who are still in Sudan. And I've been asked to join the board of directors for an organization that protects LGBTQI folks who are still in Sudan and who have escaped Sudan. So thank you for your question. I hope that answers your question. I think in most contexts, even where there is really, really bad stuff happening, there are always strong supporters of equity, diversity, inclusion, human rights, whatever you want to call it. And those are the people I gain my inspiration from, frankly.
Yeah, we have another question. How do you support caregivers that are being racialized and verbally abused in the workplace? If appropriate, can you please speak a bit about inequities in healthcare?
Yeah, so one of the jobs I've had was supporting an elderly population that was very marginalized and abused, as in women who had been abused in their marriages, um, in a particular part of Toronto that had very few resources. And when I was doing that work, I realized that there was an overall sort of predominant view, pardon me, by the authorities. I don't mean the authorities in care homes. I mean the authorities in kind of in the public realm, like in politics and in media, that the residents of the care homes were at high risk for being abused by the workers. And what wasn't being seen was that there was a high degree of abuse by the residents of the workers, and that a lot of that was based in racism, because a lot of the old people were similar dynamics to what we're seeing in BC. A lot of the old people themselves were predominantly from the dominant culture of old Anglo-Saxon Canada, and a lot of the workers were people of color. And in those contexts, I did two things. One was I gathered the workers together to ask them about their experiences of racism, and beyond their experiences of racism, also the kinds of things that they were dealing with in their lives. So these things that I mentioned at the beginning, like being responsible for supporting a whole family back home with the salary you were getting from a care home job or a P&A job. And then we worked on strategies for how to redirect, because it's very hard to tell when you're in that situation, when you're working with old people, how much of it is paranoia and senility and how much of it is genuine racism. Either way, the impact on you is the same. And so this is why I pitched my webinar today to also speak to the leadership in care homes, because we have to acknowledge that this is a reality for a lot of our workers and we need to protect them. I actually work with highly vulnerable populations who people say can't process information. So people with severe mental health issues, people with various forms of cognitive disorders and various forms of dementia. And I help them understand what racism is and how not to do it. And this is not an impossible thing to do. So, and you can do it compassionately, but you have to do it firmly so that they're not harming the people that are trying to care for them. And in fact, in some cases, they enjoy growing. In some cases, it expands their horizons. In other cases, it's a conversation you have to keep having. But at least it's explicit and you're not alone as a worker dealing with something horrible that sits with you, and you take it home and it eats away at you, and then you have to go back and be compassionate to that person again the next day. So we need a whole team approach, and we need to feel that we have the backing of our team in our approaches. I'll give you a very practical example. I had a client who needed to be discharged from a particular institution. She was ready to go back into the community. And when I was working with her, I found her, like, you know how impossible it is to find supported housing. So I had found her something. She said, oh, I'll never live in that neighborhood. There's a whole bunch of gay people in that neighborhood. I'll never go there. And I said, I'm very concerned that your prejudice against gay people is actually going to harm you because now you won't have housing because of it. Can we talk about why you're so fearful of moving to that neighborhood? And it was a way to put a boundary and say, you know, being homophobic with me, and I'm an out lesbian who works in the sector. So it was a harm that I experienced personally, as well as understanding it to be something that was problematic in the context of her life. But I was able to have an exchange with her that came from a compassionate place about what she needed and how she was limiting her own life. It was actually a very interesting conversation. I don't think anybody had ever approached her that way. And she sort of sat back and said, "Oh, I'm not prejudiced." And I said, "Well, you just said that you wouldn't move into that neighborhood. So I need to understand what it is that you're objecting to and what it is you need in a neighborhood that you're not going to get there." And in any case, it led, I think, to a very fruitful conversation where she started considering more options for her own well-being. So that's an example of a practical way to kind of have those conversations. But, you know, often we don't have a lot of time. Often what we're hearing, you know, we have to rush to the next thing. And that's why we need a team approach where we can have a huddle at the end of the day and go through some of these things together. And I always, in another situation where I was running a clinic for women who were abused, and often those women were angry and they came with all kinds of assumptions about the people who were working directly with them. We had built into our staff meeting a time for us to discuss these kinds of things and how to support each other with better responses and better ways of changing the culture in our center so that people didn't feel that that was allowable, if you will. Hopefully that answers your question.
There's a couple other comments in there. I don't know if there's one more question.
I can't see them at the moment. Do you want me to put my presentation down
Sure,
so we can see each other better?
yeah, sure. If you want to stop sharing screen and then you can just open the chat there. But the other question was, how can we foster a culture of respect among coworkers, and what strategies have others found effective in maintaining respectful relationships in the workplace?
Again, I think while I say that it's all of us that creates the culture, I really need to appeal to our leadership to be brave on this and to take the bull by the horns and create an intentional pathway to a less harmful workplace. And, you know, educating ourselves, having brave conversations, allowing people to speak, not being defensive. I think a lot of the leadership of our organizations are like me. They're older white people who, you know, fit into the norm, even though I'm queer, so I don't quite fit, but people don't know that when they first meet me. It's easy for me to just meld into the background of the kind of dominant white culture that is in the home. And you have to be a leader who has made an intention to be an ally to your staff who are experiencing these things, in order to create the mechanisms they need to support each other and to support themselves. And the joy of doing this is that you create a rapport with your workers that is absolutely unparalleled. So in the clinic that I ran, we had a very frank and honest way of being together. And I got challenged by my staff. Often, if I was missing something that they were experiencing, they would bring it to me. And we would figure out, particular strategies for each thing. What I said in the webinar is really the way you have to do it. You have to have an intervention, a set of interventions and a plan. And your plan needs to cover the whole center and work together then on the pieces of that plan so that everybody's involved. And having those brave and frank conversations and being non-defensive are key to establishing a culture that can, because there's always going to be bad stuff that's going to happen. The only thing you can be sure of is that you've created channels for communication and you've created mechanisms for when things are past a certain point and they need to be dealt with. We seem to be able to do this when, for instance, people are violent. When old people become so, demented that they're violent, we have ways of dealing with it. We have policies, we have procedures. Their families understand that we have to do things. We should have the same approach to racism. We should have the same approach to homophobia. These are also harms, and they also need to be dealt with. But we can do it in a way that is educative and compassionate.
There was another question in the Q&A. It says, how can we get managers and CEO to support these types of programs to help train employees, but also the clients we serve?
Yes, well, managing up, it's a lot of work. But I think some of the resources that I have provided in the handouts that you'll get, those resources I think are things that in part are geared to a leadership group being able to understand that this impacts their work. There are laws in BC, there are human rights laws, there are employment laws. There is the new Anti-Racism Secretariat, which is specifically going to focus on healthcare. These are things that, we can offer up as, oh, did you know, like I went to the Caring for the Caregiver webinar and there was this really interesting set of resources we got on DEI in long-term care. Would you like the bibliography? Like, sometimes it helps if we start our own little small group among staff that is just to do the side of DEI that's a little bit more palatable to people who are threatened by all of that, all of the structural pieces. And we can talk about, we have some old people in our home who don't celebrate Christmas. Could we have a Diwali ceremony at the right time of year? And just start with things that are more approachable for your managers to start seeing that this is something that needs to be done and that it's in support of the constituency that you exist to support.
That's a great segue to the next question, which is DEI being introduced and practiced worldwide? I think it's important that this kind of information everyone can learn.
Yeah, and like I said, it is, I mean, to varying degrees and with more or less success. Again, because of this question of whether you tackle it as an intervention and a structural thing that you need to do, or if you just have one-off kind of, activities. It goes by different names. I work with someone who refuses to use the terminology DEI, and she talks about anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and intersectional feminism. So why do the words matter? Okay, there's a lot of words around and a lot of people have a lot of time to play with words. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to make sure that we don't gloss over the deeply personal work and the deeply structural work that needs to be done to change the kinds of environments that racialized people are living and working in. So you know, there's a lot of unconscious and deliberate, unfortunately, forms of racism that permeate a person's day. And it's exhausting to try and stay on top of all of it. So a lot of people don't like the term DEI because it feels like a little program you do over here and then you're done and then you go home. But it's really a transformational thing that requires us to do things very differently. But nonetheless, it can be done incrementally and in small ways each and every day. It doesn't mean you tackle every single thing that happens every single day, but you can tackle most of it most days. And that starts pushing back against this feeling like you're alone, you're being silenced, you're the only one that's hearing this. And it's just this horrible weight that takes all your energy away. And without, you know, kind of being in a position to share with other people who are experiencing this and strategizing, because this is the difference between just feeling miserable together and actually making some change, is strategizing. What do we need to do to make this change? And a lot of times our jobs are precarious. We can't rock the boat too much. We're afraid that we'll lose the income we have, etc. So it's important to strategize with others. You do have protections. You have labor protections. You have human rights protections. You have all kinds of things theoretically on your side. But how do you use those in your particular context in a way that's creative and doesn't jeopardize your job if you can't afford to do that? So, you know, my answer to you is it depends exactly where you are in your life, in your workplace, and what the opportunities are around you. But if you have some colleagues who you can have these conversations with, at least you start to turn the table on that isolation and the feeling that you're all alone in this.
That's a really, really good answer. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. But before we go, I just wanted to mention our upcoming webinars. So, September 26th, which is next Thursday, we have Navigating Disability with Accessibility. And on October 8th, we have Battling Burnout, addressing compassion fatigue in the workplace. So, a lot of great topics in the works. Today's was amazing. Thank you, Amanda, for such an insightful webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to email info@safecarebc.ca. And I'm sure we can get those questions answered for you. Thanks again, Amanda, so
Oh,
much.
you're so welcome. And, you know, when you're talking about burnout, you need to talk about these things too, because a lot of times that's what leads to it.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. All right, bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.